it covers a range of biases. And I talk a lot about how unconscious bias is not limited to just race and gender, but I discuss a range of biases such as accents and ageism and looks and height, but also in technology, how bias gets manifested and how it affects bias in society as well, and look at the science of bias, the evolutionary basis of bias, and the neurological basis of bias, and what happens in our brains. So the book is quite exhaustive in that way, but gender obviously plays a huge role, and as a woman, and a woman of color, that has played a huge role in my life as well. So I will talk a little bit about that, and I talk about different aspects of gender bias that we sometimes forget or dismiss or ignore. And I'll read extracts from the book kind of and give you an idea of how I've tackled it in the book itself. So I'll start from the very start. The first thing in the book that I start off with is, "Oh, it's all right, you're a girl," he said with a laugh. This was a graduate student I shared an office with during my PhD. I asked for his help with a mathematical problem, and even though I had proven myself better at maths than him on more than one occasion, he patronizingly comforted me as he sat me down to tease out that mathematical algorithm. I was taken aback, and although usually I would let such remarks go, on that occasion, I was feeling less generous. I asked him what he meant. "Girls aren't good with numbers, and you're a girl," he said with a smile. Even though he insisted it was only a joke, I wondered then if he believed this on some level. How did his general perception that girls are not good at numbers come about? And in turn, how might these throwaway, supposedly jokey remarks that carried such skewed beliefs contribute to a wider societal bias? Now, as I run sexism workshops in primary schools and secondary schools, so many boys and girls as young as 7 years old tell me that boys are better at maths. Boys are also better at football, they tell me very seriously. These implicit gender biases are reinforced from a very young age. So that's something that I start off the book with, and if you've read it or listened to it, you would be familiar with that extract. And I wanted to start off with because although the book is based a lot in my scientific research and academic research and bringing all these kind of interdisciplinary research from social sciences and psychology and artificial intelligence and computer science and neuroscience and linguistics and everything together in one kind of a whole, tying these different strands together to talk about bias and why it's formed and how it might be helpful to us, but how it actually results in kind of negative bias in society, resulting in prejudice, discrimination, stigma that affects our actions and decisions and interactions every day. And although it's based around that, I do bring in my personal experience because the book kind of emerged as much from my personal experience and personal journey as much as my scientific and academic interest. So then I also talk about how the gender stereotypes occur in words, images, and books around us without us even realizing it, and rely on a gender binary that forces children into one of the two boxes. So I have 3 girls, and I was born as eldest of, as I was raised as the eldest of 3 girls as well. So these kind of gender biases affect me, or has affected me as a woman, as a mother, every day really. And I'm very conscious of these kind of gendered socializations that occur when we are bringing up children. Lauren Child, Waterstone's Children's Laureate for 2017-19 said, "I don't know if it's just our culture or whether it's a boy thing, that boys find it very hard to pick up a book or go to a film if a girl is the central character. I don't know where that comes from, but it worries me because it makes it harder for girls to be equal." In fact, an in-depth study of the 100 most popular children's books of 2017 show that male characters are twice as likely to take leading roles and are given far more speaking parts than females. And so, so this is kind of how we see things on screen, in books and media around us that kind of affect our perception of what we are as women, but also how boys interpret what men and women, how they're different, what girls are supposed to be like. And I gave a talk, a TEDx talk I was asked to come and give last year in India, actually, which was a little bit of a terrifying concept for me to go back to India after 20 years and do this TEDx talk. And I am not one to not take risks. So I actually decided to talk about something called Feminism is Good for Men. And And it was all about how these gender stereotypes or gender socializations are as harmful for men as for women. So feminism, when we talk about equality or women's rights, is actually as much useful for men as for women, because toxic masculinity and this kind of putting labels and boxes is very harmful for boys. And American Psychological Association has talked about mental health problem in boys, where because they are actually raised in a general way to not show emotions and not deal with the talk about their emotions, because that's not seen as masculine. And we are so they suffer from mental health issues, and we've been talking more about it. This conversation is growing these days, and these kind of boxes and labels and binary kind of divides that are set up in our society is really harmful. And as a mother of girls, I know I acknowledge this every day, and and it's very tricky for me to think about what they're seeing on screen, how that matches up with my perception of what aspiration for them, about what they should do and what they want to be, what they think they should do and they can do in life, So these kind of things really matter, even though we might think, oh, it's actually just a minor point. Why don't we just, it doesn't really matter if we go to buy children's clothes. From a very young age, they have these boys and girls sections, and girls have cutesy animals on it, and boys have dinosaurs and trucks and tractors on it. And I think that really matters, not just for parents, but for everybody, because that's what we see around us. And that's how our perception is formed from these kind of notion of what labels we assign to, what qualities we assign. And these are called stereotypes. And we form stereotypical notions of people according to the gender this assigned. And I know that people have different views on this notion of sex versus gender, but I personally have dealt with it in my book in a way that most of the studies assign, research studies that we talk about gender associations, because that's the label that the person gives to themselves and the label that society assigns to them. And sex is what we are born in, the biological sex. And so that's how I'm going to use it in this talk as well. So my interest in unconscious bias has been usually shaped by my own experience, and I've talked about it in other talks as well. So while a major thrust of the book, as I said, is scientific, I do bring in personal anecdotes. I was born in India in a deeply patriarchal society where gender divisions are laid down firmly. Growing up as one of 3 sisters, I did not conform to the stereotype of a meek, quiet Indian woman. But these kind of things, I don't know if anybody here is from that society or community, but there is a huge bias against the gender bias in there. So every parent desires a boy because they are going to look after them in old age. And so I grew up with that notion where I was told repeatedly or pitied or talked about in kind of sympathetic terms that we didn't have any brothers to look after us when we are older, or our parents. And so you always grow up with this notion that you are not the desired individual, you're not the one who's desired in this society. And so that kind of feeling that a lot of girls and women growing up in such societies and cultures carry this feeling. And I think that either makes you quite submissive and ready to conform to these kind of stereotypical notions of what a girl or woman should be, or as in my case, or in many other people I know, they make you rebel against these stereotypical notions. You don't want to fit into any of these boxes. So I had the opportunity and the freedom to denounce the roles that many women in India are expected to play: a traditional Indian wife, daughter-in-law, and mother. Because I was outspoken and knew my mind, I was often called rebellious, even when I moved to the UK. This made me acutely aware of the stereotypes that are so deeply entrenched in society and the norms against which everyone is judged. So I think, again, when we talk about stereotypes, when people see somebody or see me as a person of a color, with a particular accent, my name, these are all the kind of stereotypes that people immediately form when you meet somebody like that. And we all do that. We're all biased. If an email pops into my inbox, the way it's written, I would probably form a notion or judge a person based on that. Our name, a lot of people initially, when I used to write, used to say that I write like a man. And I don't know how that, why that is kind of that perception that men and women write differently. And I talk about that about how men and women are expected to write differently, talk differently. In fact, I don't know if you followed the debate or the discussion, especially on Twitter, around Matt Hancock and what happened with Dr. Rosina Ellen Khan about tone policing and gender policing, which is a prime example of that. And I wrote an article for The Independent, actually, which just came out this morning, or was it yesterday? Days are merging into each other, which talked especially about this, and it kind of brings in some of my research in policing and gender policing about how women are not expected to talk. So when every time a woman, especially a woman of color, makes a point about in a very straightforward and direct manner, they are seen as aggressive and threatening. And there are all these stereotypes around women of color, that especially these kind of tropes of angry Black women, which Serena Williams and Michelle Obama has also talked about how they're usually seen as aggressive, intimidating, threatening. And that's something that heavily weighs on the shoulder of a lot of women, especially women of color. So that's something that I'm very familiar with as well. So in our society, man is another prototypical default norm. So I just want to clarify that my book is not anti-men, as a couple of men have pointed out to me. It's not just rooted in kind of gender stereotypes or gender bias, or it's just kind of pro-women, anti-men agenda that I'm carrying with it. Somebody on the Independent article called me a woke-splaining feminist, which I don't know if I should carry as a badge of honor or be offended by, but that's something that happens a lot, I think, for women talking on social media or writing opinion pieces as well. Because again, it comes back to the point of, when you express an opinion strongly, you're often told that you are a badge of honor, for sure, absolutely. But when you express your opinion in a strong, direct manner, you're often kind of seen as you don't deserve that place, kind of, you don't own that place, you don't deserve that place, you should not take up that space or that place. And I'm often told, no, oh, it must be really hard to be so angry all the time, even when I'm just mildly expressing an opinion. So I think all those kind of biases come back to how women or girls grow up with this perception of themselves about what they're allowed to say, how they're supposed to act, how they're supposed to behave, and these kind of constant policing around these. And that happens in certain cultures, societies, differently, but context obviously matters a lot. But I think largely in our society, that still exists, this kind of policing of behavior. So in my book, I talk about stereotype threat. And stereotypes, we know what stereotypes are. We know that stereotypes are the kind of preconceived notions that we have of people. But stereotype threat really affects women as well. And especially when, as a woman of STEM, and in kind of domains that you're not supposed to kind of fit in, you don't belong, that kind of notion of belonging really affect people. So when women think that they don't belong in a particular domain, they're less likely to step into it. And so in kind of stereotype threat can undermine academic learning. So this happens in classrooms. While observing how girls and boys learn in a maths classroom, even though textbook and teachers are the same and the students are being treated the same, the psychologists have wondered, is it possible that they could still experience the classroom differently, so differently, in fact, as to significantly affect their performance and achievement there? The messages they get from people around them might make them aware of the stereotype, and it can even affect how quickly they learn novel concepts and their performance on tasks of learning. In engineering or science department, the stereotypes can be activated in classes with very few female students and with the instructors male too. So basically, this kind of threat that you feel, that you have this notion, the idea that you're going to be stereotyped, that you don't fit in, that you're going to be prejudiced and discriminated, that can affect your experience, but also your behavior and your the way you learn, how much you learn, and how you perform in exams and tests as well. So it's kind of a really vicious cycle as well, and a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because the more women are stereotyped, more people are stereotyped, the more they carry these stereotype threats. And the less they see role models and representations in these domains, the more stereotype threat they feel as well. So, so that affects how women enter the STEM domain. I'm very aware that we have we don't have that much time, and it's really impossible for me to cover everything that I've talked about in the book. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of the different concepts that I've talked about in the book, which stereotype threat I think is really important when we talk about gender bias. Um, so there are statistics when I remember when we were looking at admission tables and statistics of who applies to how many people apply to a particular course and the success rate. When you find that that there have been more men applying to a particular course than women, these statistics can deter women from applying to this course, giving them the perception that they do not belong there. So a research in personality and social psychology bulletin says that this is a double jeopardy, where the women, being the underdogs, are under subconscious threat of proving this stereotype to be true, which makes it difficult for them to learn new concepts and feel the pressure to demonstrate that their learning is on a par with men. So they're carrying these extra cognitive load with them, which takes up a lot of their cognitive resources. So they're carrying this load that they need to demonstrate they're better than, or at least on par with men, that they have to constantly prove themselves. And I know as a woman in STEM, in engineering, I was the first women lecturer appointed to a leading engineering department in UK. And I know that kind of that kind of pressure you feel always to constantly having to prove yourself, and that is a huge pressure, and that can affect your performance, and that can affect your mental health as well. So so that's something. And I think this independent article that Rachel has just put a link in the chat box, I talk about how notion of talking is linked to gender bias and gender inequality as well. I wrote an article, if you're interested, in Bustle magazine, online magazine, a couple of years ago about Asian women in football and stereotype threat as well, because I have now recently turned 4-year-old twins, and they've been playing football since they were 2-year-old. And I started noticing that there were no, when the women's football or the World Cup was happening, I noticed that there was no Asian women, South Asian women in this team. And so I started investigating why that might be the case, because if my children don't see any role models or representation, how would they think that they can be there one day as well? Not that I want them particularly to be playing football, but that's entirely their wish. I'm not a tiger mom at all, but but I think it's really matters. It affects. And I think I started looking at the systemic and structural biases, because we might think it's a very individual thing, and sometimes these kind of microaggressions happen in workplaces and in society. Somebody says something, we laugh it off. We also feel the pressure, I think, as a woman, to take it as a joke, because otherwise you said you're too sensitive or you can't take a joke. And I think that happens so much in workplaces and society and in family situations as well. And so I call them microaggressions, and I've written about it in the Independent as well. So if you look at the Independent page, there are quite a few articles that I've written about bias and gender bias. In Prospect as well, there are a few articles about technology and bias especially. So you can find that in Scientific American. There was recently an article I wrote about what happens in our brains when we are biased. So it was about neurological basis of bias. So you can find some of these articles as well. In Forbes, I have a lot of articles. So if you find my link to Forbes, especially about motherhood bias as well, about how women are discriminated against as soon, even when they're not mothers. There's this perception that they're going to be mothers, they're going to prioritize families over work, and so they're not as serious about their profession and career. So they always face this kind of bias against them in a very unconscious, subconscious manner as well. And so that creates a huge amount of additional stress, again, to have to prove yourself that, no, I'm really serious about my work and career. And so you're constantly having to prove yourself and constantly having to validate this thing that your career matters to you, which shouldn't have to, which it should be normalized. And also I talk about double bind bias, which I think women face a lot, which I think is, for instance, if you're women, I suppose, again, it comes back to stereotypes and social norms. There's a social norm of how women are supposed to act and what women are supposed to be. Women are supposed to be nurturing, they're supposed to be soft-spoken, they're supposed to be empathetic, compassionate. So in workplaces, that's what they expected to be. And that's what's seen as their kind of quality and property. And even when we are talking about women leaders these days, we are talking about their empathy, their compassion, this kind of feminine qualities. And I don't personally like these kind of notions of masculine and feminine qualities, because again, we are imposing some kind of labels on these properties or qualities, which all human beings have. But we we believe that these are masculine and feminine qualities because we grow up culturally conditioned that we're supposed to conform to some of the properties and qualities, and that's how we're supposed to behave. So this double bind bias happens when, because they're empathetic, compassionate, they're not seen as go-getters, and they're not seen as ambitious and aspirational and not leadership material. So even when we talk about gender equality and gender parity in the workplace, and we are bringing, organizations talk about, we are bringing in more women in the workplace, often these women do not get up to the leadership position. So I always say, it's okay if you're bringing the women to the table, but giving them a seat at the table, but do they have a voice at the table? Are they involved in the policy making? Are they involved in the decision making? Are they climbing up the ladder, so to speak? What is happening? Why are they falling out of the labor force? Why are they not going up to the top positions? And so they're not seen as leadership material. But then when women act in a kind of an ambitious way, aspirational way, all opposed to what are seen as feminine qualities, they're seen as behaving in a masculine manner. They're seen as maybe too aggressive and too threatening, and again not seen as leadership material. So it doesn't work both. It's kind of a no-win situation. It's a double bind bias women face in the workplace often. And I know about that myself, personal experience to a certain extent, but I've spoken to many women who have faced this. There's an extensive amount of research in this as well. So that's something that I think kind of just an overview of what I've talked about in the book, but there's a whole chapter called Sugar and Spice in the book, which I call Sugar and Spice. It's a really long chapter. Obviously, I could have talked about it forever and ever, but it really brings, what I try to do is to bring in some of the research that we often don't, or some of the things about stereotypes and gender bias that we don't often talk about, like women are wonderful effect. By saying that women are wonderful, it's also these kind of positive stereotypes can also harm women. So that's something, I'm conscious of the times. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as you like. If anybody has any questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. There was one that's just popped up in the chat from Anne. Is there such a concept as fatherhood bias? As we explored yesterday, the role of women in the pub, both worker and drinkers, was directly related to responsibility for the child.
I'm not entirely sure what was discussed yesterday. Could you just tell me a little bit about that, Rachel?
I think it was from a talk by Isabel yesterday about the history of the woman's place in the pub, and generally looking at how that sort of mapped out over the years.
Okay. So I think, yes, fatherhood bias exists. As I said, biases and stereotypes affect men as much as women. So although on one hand, when men look after children, they've given so much more credit than women. So when my husband looks after children, everybody appreciates him, acknowledges him, admires him for that, while I'm just supposed to do that because that's my role. But often I know that I've talked to many fathers who are, I don't like the term, but stay-at-home fathers who are staying at home, who are also stepping out of the gender norm. And that's seen as negative. They're not fully accepted, acknowledged. They are kind of seen as emasculated. And so that's something that comes into play as well, about how men are seen to, they're expected to conform to certain rules and stereotypes as well. So it harms men as much as women. And things are changing, certainly. But I think maybe the question about the responsibility for the child is directly related to the kind of how women are still in a heterosexual relationships, at least, are expected to carry most of the emotional labor at home. About even when these, like for instance, in our home, we don't have any kind of these roles and stereotypes. We try to move away as much as possible so that our children don't see that this is a man's job or a woman's job. But still, I feel that I wrote an article, kind of tongue-in-cheek article around Christmas for Huffington Post, about how it still comes down to me as a woman to organize most of Christmas, and the emotional load that women still carry, because supposedly I'm better at it, or just I feel more responsible that my house has to look nice and I have to do everything for everybody. I have to look after everything. And I think that's kind of an ingrained cultural conditioning as well, that I feel like I would be judged if things don't go a certain way, or if people, I have guests and the house is not very tidy, then I would be the one who's judged, while my husband doesn't care about it. So I think in hetero sexual relationships, that kind of emotional labor or load, I think women still carry that, and that affects. And I just wrote an article for Grazia about how this coronavirus and pandemic is going to affect gender equality. So I have a little discussion about that in there as well. So if you're interested, you can have a look. How do we go about overcoming these biases? How can we make things better? Yeah, and I think just what I hope through Sway and through the book is that people start acknowledging and accepting and recognizing these biases as well, because I think that's really the first step, that we need to understand that all of us are biased. And when we start talking about biases, sometimes people can get so defensive, that because all of us like to think we are fair-minded and egalitarian and we don't carry any biases. But through the number of case studies and research that I've talked about in the book, I've tried to bring across how this can affect in micro level, macro level, in different ways, in different kind of context. And I think that is really the first step. And then the next step is trying to educate ourselves about and be conscious about it when we are taking a decision that really affects somebody, or that is very influential decision, like a hiring, recruitment, or talking to somebody. And I think that's really the first step to do. I'm just looking at some of the other questions that are coming in. Yeah, the journey writing this book. Yeah, I can talk about that. I suppose now is not the place, but I can certainly answer any questions through messaging on Twitter if you're interested. Yes, I think in schools, certainly. Absolutely, in schools. And that's why I'm very keen to go into schools and talk to children and talk to teachers about, even in the way they teach and the educational material they provide, and the way they kind of put these play zones into play, the design the school, everything can affect these kind of gendered socialization. I've had huge conversations with my children's nursery as well about just little things, like they say, we are not forcing anybody to do anything, but I said, you need to do positive encouragement as well, so that these kind of socialized behaviors don't set in from such a young age. And I think that's really, really important. There's been a huge rise in female entrepreneurship. Yeah, I think I myself, when I left academia full time, I started a social enterprise, and I ran a couple of businesses, and I started a think tank. And I think that is indicative of how our workplaces are still not well equipped to deal with flexible working and remote working. And I hope that now what we are seeing right now, this lockdown, because everybody is working from home, that's the piece I wrote in Grazia as well, about what there might be a silver lining, that organizations might realize that actually people can work around children, that flexible working is possible, that people can work from home. And so some of these biases against women might not happen anymore. That's hope and aspiration. Personally speaking, I'm optimistic about it. But I think some of these entrepreneurship initiatives, or women starting their own business and self-employed and freelance, has come out of the fact that women are sometimes pushed out of the labor force, and they do not have the flexibility to choose what they can do. So they have to devise their own way of working around their children and family. And I think that has changed the society in a number of ways, although I'm not sure still how perceptions of women have altered that much, even with that, in terms of who gets funded, what kind of funding is available for these entrepreneurs, how much money is available. When they see a women-led business, do they still get the same kind of funding when they see a men-led business? And there's a lot of research around that as well. So yes, I think things are changing, but very slowly.
Well,
thank you so So
Dr. Agarwal, thank you very much. It's so fascinating and it's such a dense subject, and you've clearly done so much research into it. It's how you've covered so much in sort of 30 minutes is incredible. I hope that everyone enjoyed that as much as I have. Can you just tell everyone how they can get hold of your book? Because I'm sure that there's a lot of people now wanting to go out and find out more.
yeah, I hope so. So the book is available for most of the online platforms. I don't want to boost Amazon, but it's there obviously if you're interested, and it's easier. But Waterstones is really been supporting the book. Waterstones, Bloomsbury, Foyles, Blackwell's. You can find it in any of these. Some of the independent bookstores. I will tweet about it. Maybe put a tweet and you can retweet. I've sent them signed book plates, so you can get signed copies from them as well. A couple of independent bookstores. So hope you can find it easily. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us. As you said, you're on Twitter and happy to kind of take further questions on there. Yeah, hopefully we can continue the conversation and keep plugging away. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for your time. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.